Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program, we're going to be talking about something that probably a few of our listeners out there might be familiar with, at least by word, but we're going to go a little bit deeper to understand its meaning, its implications, as well as its application. As we try to navigate a world where we try to alleviate the symptoms resulting from things such as depression, ADD, ADHD, perhaps even schizophrenia, or even go into the realms of things such as the autistic spectrum, we try to find ways that perhaps we can avoid using things such as medication and surgery. After all, how often do you hear about a parent who actually sends their child to school who has been possibly diagnosed with symptoms of ADD, gets put on Ritalin, and all of a sudden says, my child seems like a robot, just doesn't seem to be there, be functioning the same way with that kind of animation that you miss. Well, if there's a more natural approach, something that might even be better at alleviating the imbalances that are caused by these kind of mental deficiencies, wouldn't that be a better approach? Well, on the program today, we're going to be joined with Dr. Lasota, who's going to be talking with us about how we can heal the emotional imbalances with homeopathy. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Dr. Lesia Lasota. Dr. Lasota, thank you for joining us here on the program today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, I understand that you have a real passion when it comes to mental health. Tell us how all this really started for you.
Well, it started when I was an undergraduate student. I was studying psychology at the time, and while I was in school, I became very sick with celiac disease. And celiac disease is a condition where the intestines are affected and are damaged, and so eventually the person starts to become very malnourished, and I lost quite a bit of weight. What I didn't expect was the effect that my physical symptoms had on my emotional state. I became quite depressed, and I was surprised by how interactive these two realms were. Especially as a psychology student, I mostly focused on the psychic realm, so to speak, and I realized that I was missing a larger picture, that the head was not sort of decapitated and floating above the body, that the two were very much interacting with each other. And so I sort of dropped my interest in becoming a psychologist, and I was trying to find something that was more encompassing for these two fields. And I eventually came across naturopathy, and even further than that, homeopathy.
Now, first describe what homeopathy is. How long has it been around, and what is its, implications, its practice?
Well, homeopathy was started by a German physician in the late 1700s. He was a very, very brilliant physician. He started reading a lot of toxicology reports at the time, and he had read about this herb that was from South America, cinchona, which is Peruvian bark, and he saw that it was used to treat malaria. And it was very interesting because when he read the toxicology reports on Peruvian bark, healthy people who took Peruvian bark ended up developing similar symptoms to people who had malaria without actually having the bug. And so he tried to find a way in which the two were connected, in which the toxicology symptoms could be used to help sort of have it be focused in a way to help guide, or I should say that he started experimenting on healthy people and cataloging the symptoms of what happens when they take Peruvian bark, and then he sort of diluted the doses and then gave them to people who actually had malaria. And on the surface, it seemed as if the symptoms were canceled. But I don't necessarily think that symptoms are necessarily canceled, but that somehow it increased the person's own vitality to be able to fight off the bug.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because this is kind of one of those fields that people who have little understanding and really seem to lean more toward conventional Western approaches tend to think, well, this is kind of one of them old wives' tales sort of a thing. But there's really a lot more science and a lot more precision and thoroughness, it seems, to homeopathy than a lot of people might think.
Well, there have been some major advances in quantum physics. I just read last week that at CERN, the big particle collider on the border between France and Switzerland, they're actually planning to make sort of very tiny big bangs, sorry, not big bangs, very tiny black holes in which they plan to leak gravity onto parallel dimensions. And with these advances, incredible advances in quantum physics and in biology, I think compared to these fields, medical science is pretty slow in catching up to these advancements. Knowing what we know about quantum physics today, things that we used to learn in school about how electrons, protons, and neutrons are the smallest particles in our universe is absolutely no longer true. You can actually break them up even further. And even behind these very tiny particles, there seems to be a whole sea of energy and of frequencies. And it seems now that energy actually gives birth to matter. And so I think that homeopathy kind of works on this level of energy, because what ends up happening when you dilute a certain substance from nature, you remove the matter part of the substance, and then what you're left with is the frequency. So you essentially match that frequency of that substance with a pattern that's found in someone's symptoms. So you find a pattern in someone's story, in someone's history, and you match that pattern with a substance in nature that has that exact same pattern using frequencies. Mm-hmm. And an experiment that you can easily do at home if you have the materials is you can take tuning forks. For example, in my office right now, I have a tuning fork for the note C. And if I bang it against the table and then hold it next to another tuning fork that's also the note C without it actually touching, the second tuning fork will actually start resonating as well. And if I bang the tuning fork of C and then hold it against another tuning fork that maybe is like C sharp or B, they also start to ring out, but not as strongly. And then if you were to match it up with a tuning fork, like say the note of G, then it doesn't ring at all. So what ends up happening is that with each substance that's in nature, it comes with a very specific set of patterns, and the matching of the remedy to the person needs to be exactly so that they almost let each other ring, they resonate with each other, they increase the vitality of that person, the ability to resist against the stressors of life, to fight back. And I know this is it's a bit much. It's very hard to describe homeopathy, to explain how it works.
Well, I think, I really, just so we can be clear with our listeners, this is what I'm seeming to understand, is that you take a look at a person's story, if you will, and, we can ascribe a particular mental health condition, I guess, and say, okay, well, taking a look at your story, let's go ahead and pull back, sort of take an overall view of you, and see how you emerge with patterns that we may come to know in nature, and see how we can bring these two together to become balanced to the point that that pattern no longer exists anymore. So it's sort of like cures like in a way. Is that sort of a way to look at this?
Mm-hmm, exactly so.
Okay. I wanted to be sure about that because it's really interesting as you say that, because I remember years ago I was reading Allan Watts. A lot of people might remember him as the English philosopher who came along and was one of the primary people that introduced Zen to the West, so to speak. Mm-hmm. And I remember reading in his book, he was talking about mental health, and he says it's so interesting how in the West what they tend to do is they send somebody who might have a mental health disorder to a psychologist, and this guy sits and, or gal sits and asks a bunch of questions, look at family history, and then tries to find a more direct individual approach. It could be through medications, talk therapy, whatever it is. And what he suggested is that what they should be doing is sending these people to, anthropologists, to find out just exactly what you're talking about. With this person's particular mental nature, in anthropology it's the study of cultures and, and how they function. And certainly different cultures function in different ways. So maybe this person is out of place in the society that they're in. Find a culture they would be most suited for, place them there, and kind of felt that as though this mental health challenge they were facing would somehow just melt away because there's a sense of belonging in that culture they found. Does that make sense?
It does. It kind of reminds me of the story that I heard about a Greek gentleman who moved to America after World War II, and he became quite ill and developed cancer, and his doctors told him that there was no chance for him, so he ended up deciding to sort of settle his affairs back in Greece, where he was from, and he settled on this Greek island and stayed there for a while, leaving his family back in America, and he led a very easy life. He returned back to his old Greek diet. He took long walks every day and worked in his garden and had tea in the evening with his friends. And over time, he realized that, he was still around, that he felt better than he ever did before. And he went back to America and visited the doctors there. And the doctors said that he had no signs of cancer. And it was pretty remarkable. And he continued to live back in Greece, and eventually all of his doctors passed away, and he continued living, even though he was supposedly, that he wasn't supposed to live for very long,
right.
But he continued living. And that kind of sets into, it kind of makes you question what would be entailed with health. Is it diet? Is it the social aspect of him feeling part of a community, or is it that he gets to feel like he is at home? Maybe also he gets to walk around a good deal and sleep as much as he wants. There are a lot of things that kind of play into health. Mm-hmm. And it could be that the return to the culture is a part of his healing process as well.
Now, what kind of conditions have you worked with?
I have worked a lot with depression and anxiety. I have worked with one case of schizophrenia, which I found very interesting. With these cases, there's definitely a pattern that arises from their story, and everyone experiences their symptoms very differently. Everyone has their own vulnerabilities and their own susceptibilities. One thing that may stress one person may be very different, or may not even affect another person. And with homeopathy, it's more like increasing one's resilience to those stressors that tend to affect them. Remedies that are commonly given for depression are remedies like Nat Mur, Ignatia, and Orem, and they all have their own individual stories. For example, a remedy like Nat Mur, there's often a history of emotional vulnerability, maybe some experience associated with grief had affected them, like a death of a loved one or family member, or a very bad breakup leaves them feeling emotionally tender, and so they close themselves up, and they start to remove themselves from society a little, and they start to feel depressed. And that's one way that someone can experience depression. Another way would be like an Orem picture, where someone is very hardworking, has high ideals in life, and when someone sets such high ideals of what they expect from life and what they expect of themselves, oftentimes our idealistic nature doesn't match up to what reality is, and so they often feel like a sense of failure or guilt, maybe, of not having achieved these goals of theirs, and that can send them down into a state of depression. So everyone experiences depression differently, and experience anxiety very differently as well. And there are different stories associated with each state.
And you can also imagine, too, the layers. For instance, the example that you were giving of somebody that didn't feel that they have lived up to whatever this elusive potential is. And you take a look at, for instance, the messages that surround us, especially here in America, about that very thing. We're always being compared to the lifestyles of everyone else, with sort of an underlying sneer that if you're not here, then there's something wrong with you. And imagine that layer after layer and day after day and year after year, you keep being hammered with these messages about what you're missing, what you don't have, and how come you don't measure up. and then they kind of act like depression is this cloud that just somehow appears one day, and we have somehow this remedy that just may help you out of all this. How about stopping the noise for a minute? I'll bet you have a lot of thoughts on that, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, homeopathy can help a lot in terms of strengthening your ability to resist against these sort of stressors in your life. But also, I mean, if the root cause of the depression or the anxiety is a really stressful job, then of course the treatment would be to maybe find a different job, or find a job that's more in line with what you're interested in, what you feel passionate about. Or if you feel depressed because you're in a relationship with someone who is very mean to you, or doesn't love you back, or I mean, there are many reasons why a relationship could be potentially toxic to you, but if the root cause of your depression is a toxic relationship, then, I mean, homeopathy can only do so much. The relationship would have to be addressed first.
Mm-hmm. Now, it also sounds to me, too, that you take an approach where the patient or person, whatever we want to call an individual in this case, needs to really own up to the responsibility of the direction that they want to go with their treatment. So they're not just kind of throwing the cards all on the table and saying, okay, now you figure out what needs to happen here, and then give me a cure, and I need to walk out here, and this should work. And I find that happening so often, that we have sort of surrendered what we know about ourselves to people that we feel know better about us than we do. And so we kind of really miss the point. And boy, in a society that gets so litigious, especially when it comes to so-called malpractice, it kind of gets really crazy to navigate the field on what the best way is when it comes to personal responsibility. Have you kind of encountered those kinds of things?
Yes. I mean, homeopathy does wonderful things, but it's not necessarily a magic pill. It won't cure everything for you, because
right.
Life can still be very stressful. And it's definitely wise for the patient to also understand that they also need to take responsibility for their own actions, and to take control of their life, to realize where something is not working for them, and to at least attempt to try and remedy their situation. It's not that by taking the remedy you'll forever have good days from now on. I mean, stressful things will still come, but there are still ways in which you can make yourself healthier. Mm-hmm. And I can't stress this enough, but diet also plays a really important role in mental health. So if you are someone who tends to be depressed and you want homeopathy to help address your depression, the homeopathy, of course, can certainly address depression if it is correctly prescribed, but you also want to give yourself support in other ways too. In other parts of your life, you want to make sure that you're surrounded by supportive friends and family, and make sure you're eating a diet that will give you the building blocks to make neurotransmitters to help decrease inflammation in the body. And you want to find something in your life that gives you meaning as well. Passion about a certain topic, or a hobby, or a job that you really love. I mean, these things also play an incredible part in your mental health.
Now, as you've treated people, have you found some commonalities about their causes of anxiety? I know that you said earlier in the program that, really everybody is uniquely different and how this all comes on, and so the approach seems to be adapted individually rather than just a one-size-fits-all sort of a way of going here.
Commonality.
For instance, it's just a screaming loud world, or their diets seem to have a lot of the same sort of things. Maybe they all go to, fast food restaurants and they don't eat well, just sort of those kinds of things.
Well, I see commonality in the stressors in life. It's true that we live in a world that's very fast-paced and has high expectations for everyone who lives in it, and those things in itself are very stressful to the body, to the mind. But I think what makes us unique is how we react to those stressors. So I'm sure all of us have had bad breakups. Those are very stressful. But one individual may end up going into his room and crying by himself alone and listening to sad music. Another person may immediately find another partner because they feel lonely. Or somebody else may start to feel very anxious and has fears of rejection that start to form. Those very specific symptoms kind of help lead the homeopath to a specific remedy. It's not so much that it will decrease the stressors in life, but help mitigate their reaction to those stressors.
Mm-hmm. Now, how can people find out more about you? Is there a website that they can go to find out more about this?
Yes, there is. My website is www.arborvitaenaturalhealth.com. I probably should spell that. Arbor is ARBORVITAE, Natural Health. Arbor Vitae is the tree of life. It's the thuya or cedar tree. And it's been used in actually many different forms of medicine, Chinese medicine, in homeopathy, and also herbal medicine too. Very useful for many things.
Now, when it comes to alternative medicine or homeopathy, as we're talking about, somebody listening to this decides, this might be something I want to explore. What can they anticipate versus going to, let's say, a regular doctor? Not that there's really much of a difference because, both of the goals are to get you into a place that you want to be, of well-being, whatever that state is. But does it kind of have a different approach? It sounds to me like you really sit down and you listen to what the person has to say. I mean, you really do some exploration and to see how we can achieve the particular goals that they're trying to achieve.
Mm-hmm. With medical doctors, appointments can be maybe 15 to 30 minutes long, and they will listen to the physical symptoms. So say that the symptom is palpitations, racing heart. And so the doctor will listen. Okay, so these are the symptoms of palpitations. My heart feels like it's pounding really fast. Okay, that's very interesting. They take your heart rate. With a naturopath, they are interested in that you have palpitations, but then, if you tell them I drink six cups of coffee a day, they'll say, that's very interesting.
Haven't had a raise in 6 years.
A naturopath they may spend like 60 minutes to 90 minutes with a patient, and they're very interested in the backgrounds of the patient, the diet, their lifestyle choices, the things that would have a very direct effect on their physical symptoms. With a homeopath, I think they're more interested in the story. So if you tell them, if you tell a homeopath, I have palpitations, they're like, oh, really? Tell me more about it. It's definitely worse when I lie on my left side. You might see like a homeopath's eyes like widen and get really excited. Oh, really? That's very interesting. It may not seem that important. It may not be something that you would think, I'm sure my medical doctor would be very interested that my heart palpitations are worse when I lie on my left side, or the fact that these palpitations came on immediately after the loss of a job. The story behind the palpitations, I think, would be more interesting to a homeopath, if that makes sense.
Well, it does, because I was remembering a time years ago that for a while I was having a lot of, upset stomach. And it was at a point where it felt like there was sort of something inside of me that was gnawing away, and it wouldn't just be in the stomach area. It'd sometimes move after I would eat. It would move into areas. So I was kind of making an assumption. It feels like it's moving into my intestines, that sort of a thing. And so this went on for quite a while, and I just couldn't seem to figure out what it was. Not that I was really looking into it. I figured it was something that would come and then it would go. And as it went on, and it could be very uncomfortable actually, I started thinking, well, when did this first start for me? When can I remember this first starting? And so as I looked back on that, and I started realizing, well, what did I start doing differently that might have brought this on? And I realized that there were these mints that I was using, even though it was just a couple of times a day. But I could realize, well, that was the time I started using these regularly. And as I started pulling those out, not using them at all anymore, I just hadn't experienced those symptoms anymore. So really paying attention, and that's where I, say, as I mentioned earlier in the program, that people really can come to understand a lot of these symptoms and these feelings if they just pay attention to what's really going on. Really kind of go in and listen to what the body is telling you, and maybe go to a person such as yourself to help kind of coach you along and say, well, maybe we're on the right track here. Let's see what we can do about it, rather than, oh, I've got this ache here. What can you give me to get rid of it? Because a lot of times it doesn't tend to be something that, just came on. It could have been just sitting there waiting because there's been triggers and things been happening in your life that eventually cause it to get to a point where it's trying to say, I think it's time you start paying attention here.
Yes.
The story, as you say, the literature story.
Yes. It's actually the reason why I really enjoyed homeopathy, the reason why I really enjoyed studying it was because I felt that it was a very practical application to a deep love of mine, which is listening to stories or reading stories. When I take a homeopathic case, I'm often reminded of the time when I was in middle school or high school in English Lit, and we'd be given various books to read, like The Scarlet Letter or A Tale of Two Cities, and the teacher would ask us to write a paper afterwards. Describe the themes that are happening here, the patterns. What is this book trying to tell you? What is the development of this character over the length of the story? And so we would write these papers, and I noticed that I do the same thing when I listen to somebody's story. I'm trying to find an overall theme. Like, what is this person's life trying to tell me? What are these symptoms trying to tell me? What is the progression of these symptoms in the story? And how did they, as a person, change over time? And the fun thing is that I don't necessarily get to write a paper at the end of the visit. I give something to make their life easier for them. It's a more satisfactory way to listen to a story, I think.
Well, I would think so, too, and it's a lot like sleuthing, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I imagine that I'm a bit of a detective that's snooping around for clues, like what is it that this person's trying to tell me? And it may be that they may not see the pattern, but oftentimes I find that people are well aware of the pattern themselves.
I'll bet you experience a lot of aha moments with people that visit with you, don't you?
Yes, I would say so.
It isn't like one of those, oh, thanks, Doc, here's the patch and you're sent on your way, but it's more like, I never thought about it that way before. I remember when I first went to a naturopath many years ago, and we sat down, and the very first question she asked me was, are you happy? And it kind of blew my mind because I didn't remember a doctor ever asking me that before. So I thought about it. I said, right now, no, I'm really not that happy at all. I can't stand what I'm doing, and so I think it was a few weeks later, I said, I'm giving my notice. Well, what for? I said, because this job just doesn't suit me anymore.
Wow.
And that changed a lot of things right there. So
yeah, that's known as a therapeutic visit. Just the interaction with the doctor has created enough of a catalyst that would cause positive changes in a person's life.
Mm-hmm. That sure is fascinating work. I can see that you probably enjoy getting up each day wondering what's next around the corner, don't you? As we all should be, actually. Well, Dr. Lasota, I want to first thank you for being on our program today. And for our listeners, go ahead and give out that website again.
Thank you very much.
And the website?
Oh, sorry, the website. www.arborvitaenaturalhealth@gmail. I just gave my email address.
That's
sorry,
okay.
It's www.arborvitaenaturalhealth.com.
And if they want to shoot any questions to you, Dr. Lasota, about anything, what is your email?
It's the same as before at gmail.com, so arborvitaenaturalhealth@gmail.com.
Very good. Dr. Lasota, thank you for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you very much for having me.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there. Again, as we always say here on the program, take personal responsibility for where you're at, and if you feel you need somebody to guide you along to get you to where you need to go, well, that's what we're all about here. You can also find out more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. And also be sure to sign up for our free weekly e-news updates. We can also be followed on Twitter at Beyond50Radio. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past